thank you so much to Ahmed Ilmi and Koli Chow for organizing this on behalf of the Department of Social Justice Education. I know Elizabeth and I are so happy to be here today and have this chance to talk together about the work we've been doing. And it's rather shocking that in the 5 years we've been working together, we've rarely had a chance to present together. We've presented our work separately at occasions, but yeah, it's really wonderful to be here as well with Elizabeth. So what we hope to do today is to shed some light on these crazy times of upside downness, utter confusion, and the non-sensibility of this political moment and era, marked in particular by the rise of Trumpism and what in our book we call propaganda by other means, these infinitely creative new modalities of propaganda and disinformation that are intertwined with news media and digital platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc. In thinking about this talk, we recognize that it's a moment in which most often, every time one of us or our friends or family pose a question to one another about what's going on, basically the best answer is WTF, or pardon the language, you know, what the, right? So this talk draws from the work we've done over the past 5 years investigating emotion, affect, and media, and from our recently published edited book with Routledge, as well as a forthcoming special issue of the journal Cultural Studies that will be on the politics of emotion beyond the end of history. And our interdisciplinary work addresses the gaps across fields such as media studies, communications, and cultural studies to map the ways in which emotion and affect play a role in politics and how digital media, and particularly the far right, weaponize emotion and affect. So our first slide, and returning to the title of our talk, how can Trump possibly call himself the least racist person in the room? And another question, why would he even want to, given that his entire shtick is about being racist, misogynist, and transgressive? I'm echoing here.
I think
You got it? Okay. So yeah, he wants to be transgressive. So why is he claiming that? And of course, he likes to tell it like it is, as his supporters say. So why would he claim this? In 2016, we probably would have reacted with surprise to this ludicrous statement. But in 2020, we noticed that both ourselves and newscasters seem to be just exhausted from so many years of these lies and BS coming from the White House. We found ourselves turning to Umberto Eco, who in 1995 wrote what is now one of the most often cited essays summarizing the tenets of fascism. And his work is informed by having lived through this in Italy, lived through fascism. Central to fascism, he shows, is what's known as structured confusion. And indeed, Elizabeth and I have learned so much since 2016 about how the very purpose of propaganda and disinformation is precisely to create confusion and mistrust. So looking at the contemporary digital landscape as structured confusion, we want to ask, how precisely is this confusion structured? There are 3 points we want to emphasize in this talk. One, that we can't just look at how racism and emotionality are expressed, you know, through digital media in terms of actual content and what people say, but we have to examine the technological infrastructures of digital media that shape the racism and emotionality in very particular ways. And we call this, sorry for all this, you know, big terms, but we call this affective information warfare. Second point, we want to illustrate the rise of digital militarism and digital fascism. And third, we want to point to the upside down of identity politics and how the right wing in particular increasingly uses identity politics to frame their rhetoric. So this next slide depicts how it was our own sense of confusion first in 2016 when the term post-truth was named Word of the Year. And that term is defined as a historical moment in which emotion rather than facts defines what counts as truth. And this in part sparked our collaborative work. But of course, politics has always been emotional, right? And as we've argued for years regarding this, post-truth, or the idea that facts have given way to feelings, is not new. This is not a new phenomenon. However, today's version of post-truth and the increasing visibility of emotion in politics allows us to bring our expertise as scholars of emotion to understand this structured confusion. So our work tries to address the gaps in scholarship about how digital media and these platforms of media exploit emotion and affect, particularly for purposes of engendering racism and misogyny on the far right. And this is what we call affective information warfare. So this affective info warfare takes place through a term in media studies known as platform politics. Platform politics are a way of talking about the architecture of social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, etc., and how those actual architecture, not the content of what you and I post in there, but the architecture are responsible for shaping contemporary political debates and what we can say and how we say it. So there's been much focus on the economic and political motivations that drive platform politics. And examples of this include the news industries that push out clickbait, that is, news that actually needs us to click on it to keep profit margins in this headline scanning environment, or political actors like the Russian Internet Agency developing bots and trolls and false accounts that can game the system and produce propaganda using these platforms, or Trump utilizing Twitter as a platform for structuring his propaganda. All of these platform politics weaponize identity politics in particular, and we'll just show you more about that throughout this talk. So, however, in the course of our research over these years, we've discovered a very significant gap regarding a third pillar of this phenomenon. So there's the politics, the economics of platform politics, but the gap has been around the military and military interests and the logic of militarism that itself needs to exploit platform politics and emotion. So the talk is structured in this way. First, we will define digital fascism, digital militarism. Secondly, we'll provide examples of the economic and political interests that shape the platform politics. Third, examples of how militarism and the military shape these digital infrastructures and use emotion. And throughout, we hope to illustrate how the far right discourses and racism in particular exploit emotions through digital media infrastructures. Over to Elizabeth.
Hey, thank you. So, and I'm hoping everyone can see the slides appropriately. I'm going to jump in and talk a bit about digital militarism and digital fascism and where we're taking this from. So fascism in broad strokes is a political formation that emphasizes an ultra-nationalist identity where nation is understood in racial, ethnic, and or religious terms. It's bent on mobilizing society into camps of us versus them, and it relies on a gendered hierarchy of authority in order to do this. Fascism involves perception of an endangered community that needs to be reborn through extraordinary means, and it positions an actually dominant group as a victim. So in this talk, we want to emphasize militarism as a component of fascism and as a necessary component of fascism. Adi Kunzman and Rebecca Stein developed the term digital militarism in their 2015 book, shown on the slide, to describe the use of social networking technologies in support of Israeli militarism. They show how the IDF uses social media to replace political ideology and didacticism with what they call everyday digital militarism. And this everyday digital militarism is enacted by conscripting soldiers and civilians, and the state as well, to disseminate a kind of militarized affect through likes and shares of social media posts in support of Israel and its military occupation. Share this, these are direct examples. Share this if you agree that Israel has the right to self-defense. Like this if you love the Israeli army. In this way, the everyday and the everyman becomes a conduit for digital militarism. Digital fascism is described in a quite similar way in a 2019 working paper, an essay by Meik Felix and Holger Marx. And key to their concept of digital fascism is an emphasis on how the very infrastructure of digital and social media stimulate perceptions of imperilment, how social media infrastructures readily serve to spread fears that are central to fascism. They outline how fascism is no longer just a matter of consuming top-down propaganda and rhetoric, but of having social media users function like a swarm and actually taking part in the propaganda. So taking part in the production of information by liking, sharing, commenting on content, functioning as multipliers of fascist dynamics. And they argue that this new perspective on fascism, on digital fascism, which is more diffused, describes the unique affective style and rhetoric of what we are witnessing today. In digital fascism, they say membership is not so much about following orders, but rather emotions that are triggering people to act. The job of a digital far-right leader is thus to push the right buttons on social media to make this emotional machine work for them. So fascist organizing today, they argue, is less about fascist parties with formal hierarchies and leaders or unidirectional propaganda. Instead, this digital fascism and digital militarism relies on the Trojan horse of the everyday user who engages technologies of affect that are inherent to social media practices. So in all of what follows, we're both going to be describing digital militarism and digital fascism, where they come from and how they rely on technologies of affect. But to begin, I want to start by taking us back, way back to the advent of the digital. And I've been thinking a lot about how cell phones that we use ubiquitously are gamifying so many aspects of our lives, because we're going to talk about games and war games as we go forward. So cell phones really gamify many aspects of our lives, and I'm not just talking about games like Candy Crush, but how trading on the stock market is gamified through apps. Social networks are gamified through Facebook and other social media. And all these apps are like games. They have bells and whistles, and especially that red pop-up notification, which is designed to keep you hooked on the platform. And of course, app designers are trying to make things fun and to make them addictive, or both, just like games in general. So in a kind of Marshall McLuhan sense, or as McLuhan might have said, like the cell phone becomes the extension of our bodies and of our minds. And while I know this has certainly been said, but I just wanted to recall it because I think it's actually really hard to kind of tangibly remember even life before Facebook for some of us, much less a time when individual computing devices weighed thousands of pounds. So this slide shows a 1959 computer on which the first computer game was made. That was Space War, and it was made on the PDP-1 computer, which, believe it or not, was referred to as one of the original mini computers. And if you look at the slide, it's enormous. It's like a vending machine next to a desk with a typewriter and a huge screen on it. It was also, this PDP-1 was one of the first computers to prioritize the user experience rather than efficient computer cycles, rather than the hardware. So in this sense, it's kind of like the great grandpa of the cell phone, because it's kind of the first time that computers were turning towards the user, right, towards the interaction as a priority. And giving our first hints at the role of digital militarism here, that first computer game, Space War, was made on this huge honking computer by students at MIT who were funded by the Pentagon. Now, the other image on the slide is a little squiggly drawing of a couple of different boxes drawn together with lines. And that is the first iteration and the technological backbone of the internet itself, which was the US military's ARPANET. And obviously the Zoom talk would not be possible on the ARPANET, which in this illustration from 1969 had just 4 connecting nodes. So I found this image of the PDP-1 and the ARPANET really useful as we're trying to give account here of the workings of digital affect, because it recalls quite clearly a time that we have left behind. Fast forward to today, in the post-truth media context that Megan described, we have a much different picture. We are, as we all know, much more closely embedded in these everyday digital technologies. One of the results of our embedded nature in digital technologies is that politics has become reshaped through platforms. And today we're struggling with massive problems of disinformation through these platforms. The problem is so acute, domestically and internationally, that some have begun to characterize disinformation in the context of cyber warfare. And as it turns out, cyber war is really not what we thought it would be. For example, in their 2018 book, Like War, Singer and Brooking, two self-described internet junkies and defense analysts, said, quote, "We'd often been told cyber warfare would be a techno nightmare marked by crashing networks, the disruption of financial markets, and electrical outages. But the actual battlefields of cyber war have turned out to be quite different." As Singer and Brooking continue, narrative, emotion, authenticity are the most effective tools of online battles. These new wars are not won by missiles and bombs, but by those able to shape the storylines and connect with us at the most personal level. And so if you're looking at the slide now, to put things into 90s Hollywood movie terms, cyber war was expected to be like Terminator, when John Connor, if I remember the movie correctly, has to hack the mainframe to defeat Skynet to prevent the AI from launching this nuclear attack on human civilization. It's less like that, and it's more like You've Got Mail, which is at the dawn of digital media becoming a mainstream facet of everyday life. These characters, played by Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, meet in an over 30s chat room, and they construct an anonymous romance via email. The point is that cyber warfare, digital militarism, digital fascism, they all capitalize on intimacy. They use social media to get under your skin. And cyber warfare turned out to be more about the ties that bind than about malicious entities hacking into the power grid, for example, which also happens. But unlike this 90s rom-com, where the lovers have to test whether their relationship formed online can last in the real world, today, we tend much less to draw this sharp distinction between on and offline spheres, precisely because they're so interconnected. When people are plugged into digital media all day, what they're plugged into is an extraction machine. And we go into this with much more nuance in our recent edited collection, but in brief, I want to use Shoshana Zuboff's notion of the rise of surveillance capitalism as a way to give an overview of digital technologies of affect, or put differently, how platform politics relies on and extracts emotion. So beginning with Google, Zuboff argues, in the early 2000s, tech companies realized that the user information that they gather for maintenance and improvement of their platforms far outsized the data that they actually needed. And she calls this discovery of that extra data a behavioral surplus. And this image on screen on the first slide, it's her illustration of how data is used to maintain a platform like Google search. The data is generated by users as we're just using Google, and it kind of circles through a closed unit to improve how the search engine works. Then, Zuboff writes, companies realized how much extra data they were actually capturing about people, that they were able to capture about people. And of course, search engines, not to mention other apps, they know everything that you look up. They predict, they know what you click on, whether it's an ad or a cat picture or how many times you check your email. And since they know what you do, they can predict what you will do. And they sell you as an audience to advertisers, as well as to political firms, we found out. And Megan will talk a bit more about Cambridge Analytica later. So, and in predicting what you will do and selling you to advertisers, they're also nudging you to behave in particular ways. And all of this is now routinely calculated and sold on what Zuboff calls a behavioral futures market. So in this second diagram I've put up on the screen, it just shows how an entire apparatus has been created by different platforms to capture and then utilize and commodify all of this data about our personal lives. So while Zuboff uses the term behavioral data and behavioral surplus, we could also talk about this in terms of emotional data, because of course, a lot of what's being gathered has to do with what people like and what we hate and what makes us click on things and what makes us send things and what keeps us glued to platforms. So we can see how these technologies of affective capture are increasingly part of the architecture of digital media, as our intimate and private lives are constantly being turned into data and commodified and sold. That's one aspect of platform politics, but we also have to look at how people are actually using social media platforms. Since 2016, we have seen a lot of attention to emotion in journalism. And one of the key themes that has emerged is that not all emotions are created equal when it comes to monetization and generating virality in digital media. Some scholars, journalists, and social media influencers and firms as well have indicated or describe it in the sense that high arousal emotions are key to making things go viral. So something like anger, outrage, awe, excitement, all of these things give a lot more traction than sadness and sobriety and depression in digital media, for example. So as Megan said, politics, it's always been emotional, but now we see a new density of emotion taking place in this digital field. And there's no doubt that it's an effect, in part, of these new digital technologies and practices. So, okay, emotion is key to platform politics, you get that. Information warfare, or affective information warfare, it's shaped by emotions, you get that. Now, we want to turn to a kind of origin story of digital militarism in the contemporary US and Canadian context. And so we're going to turn back to Gamergate. Gamergate was the canary in the coal mine, said Brianna Wu, a games developer and one of the main targets of Gamergate attacks. From Gamergate, she's saying, we should have predicted the Trump election. We should have predicted the rise of the alt-right, of digital fascism. Firstly, Gamergate, it shows an eruption of male identity politics. And I know it's actually hard to remember what happened earlier this year, much less what happened in 2014, but I promise you that we think it's worth it. So Gamergate in 2014, it shows us this eruption of male identity politics. The whole thing was began with a vengeful ex-boyfriend lashing out against his ex-girlfriend, saying she had slept with this games reviewer to get a positive review of her new game. But it took off from this personal story and became this massive, coordinated online series of campaigns of harassment of women, and to a lesser extent, people of color who are in the gaming industry. And then it became even bigger than that. It quickly grew into this larger right-wing backlash, bringing together gamers, men's rights advocates, and the new emergent alt-right faction of the right wing. You'll recall that Gamergate, or you may recall that Gamergate was amplified by Milo Yiannopoulos and Breitbart under the direction of Steve Bannon, who's the later Trump campaign CEO and White House advisor. And those people are the key big names and visible links between Gamergate, the development of the alt-right, and the Trump presidency. As Gamergate was amplified in these different digital fields, and of course crossover into more mainstream media because so much was going on, so much harassment was going on. As it was amplified, the rhetoric also shifted. From women in gaming, it became an attack on progressive values and especially social justice warriors. In Gamergate, we find the roots actually of all of the key ideas of this talk. We see this reversal of identity politics to center whiteness and maleness. We see the success of the alt-right in coordinating new factions of the right wing. And we see a certain creeping militarism among male youth culture. The whole thing was understood by the trolls as both a militaristic game and a form of activism at the same time. So Gamergate, it wasn't just about games, it was about the gamification of politics. It showed us a first glimpse of how trolling, basically emotionally baiting people online by posting inflammatory things and rhetoric for fun, it showed us how this trolling could be used as a political tactic, and it was used very successfully. So Gamergate was the canary in the coal mine because it gave the alt-right shape and visibility, and as scholars and journalists have documented, this movement was a key force behind the organization of the Unite the Right rally, where white supremacists burst into the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, where, amongst other things, they murdered a protester with a car attack in August 2017. Gamergate also illustrates this upside down of identity politics we've been talking about, as it bolstered the idea of white male identity being under siege and under threat. And of course, we've also indicated this is a key aspect of fascism. So Gamergate shows us how misogyny and racism are kind of flexibly linked in the emergent far-right digital subcultures. And we see this as a constant theme running through right-wing movements today. Because there isn't a single program of right-wing extremism. We know that right-wing extremism is on the rise, but it's not in a single coherent way. There are multiple formations of right-wing extremism, and they're getting linked together through white supremacy, through misogyny, through immigration and nationalism stances, through things like gun rights, through pro-police stances and anti-government stances. On this slide, there are a few images of the Boogaloo Boys, which is perhaps one of the most recent example of 4chan memes escaping from these message boards and manifesting in violent far-right-wing protests, like on the streets. And one of the clearest things about this loosely connected group of right-wing people under the banner of Boogaloo is that the clearest thing is that they're not clear. They're not really coherent or consistent with one another. They have different stated viewpoints with respect to racism, with respect to policing, and yet they are all definitively part of the right-wing white supremacist movement. So there are multiple issues animating right-wing movements today, and they're not all consistent, but there's also this intentional obfuscation, right? With respect to the alt-right, Richard Spencer, one of its key figureheads, for example, says the alt-right is not white supremacist. They are in favor of white culture and white identity. This obviously intends to push white supremacy into the mainstream as a wolf in sheep's clothing. But because there isn't necessarily political coherence to these right-wing groups and rhetoric, it's not only confusing, as we've discussed, it's difficult to track what's going on. So finally, with these groups, I wanted to note, and maybe we'll talk about this more in the Q&A, that it's often not clear where we draw the line between what a digital subculture is doing and what a social movement is doing, and where these things are bleeding into each other on the right wing today. So I've given an overview of how platform politics weaponizes emotionality and how we see this playing out in certain right-wing spaces and movements today. And I'll turn it back over to you, Megan, to talk more about how we're understanding this relationship between digital militarism and fascism and places where we see that showing up.
Great, awesome. So we're left with the question, how do we think about the ways that militarism shapes these platform politics? I'm going to provide examples of 3 different ways that militarism shapes digital fascism. So when we're talking about this, we're not trying to make a media claims effect that these games produce particular viewpoints necessarily, but we are trying to emphasize how the US military, of course, understands that things like video games absolutely shape public consciousness and can help mobilize soldiers and potential soldiers. So video games exemplify a site of the affective info warfare. They shape emotions through these digital infrastructures. And today, many of the most popular video games, as well as some of the less popular ones, have some connection to the US military, whether they're funded or created by the US Army, as is the case with America's Army or Full Spectrum Warrior games, or whether the Pentagon is chasing after video game writers to help them advise Washington think tanks, which is the case with the Call of Duty, or whether we're talking about the hardware crossing over so that we have results as in drone pilots describing their jobs as, quote, pretty much like playing a video game all day long, or whether we're looking at Congresswoman AOC calling out the US military for using the live streaming gaming app Twitch to recruit young people, potentially as young as 14. And there are other examples, of course. So the US military has extensive involvement with video gaming, and one example of that is the Army-funded Institute for Creative Technologies at the University of Southern California, where military applications of virtual reality are a very hot research agenda these days, as well as using video games for demobilization and even for post-traumatic stress disorder therapies for soldiers. So moving to the next slide, the summary here is that gaming isn't the only field where the military partakes of contemporary digital politics, but that we see digital media being used for emotional leveraging and shaping the sensibilities of large swaths of the population, including you and I. So one of the most glaring examples, and we talk about this at great length in our book, is the role of military interests shaping digital propaganda through such things as Cambridge Analytica, which you'll recall. So the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal news exploded in the headlines in March 2018, when it was revealed that this propaganda firm was working with right-wing clients using very sophisticated behavioral ad technologies, targeting emotions and political messages that couldn't be tracked by the public. Cambridge Analytica was using illegally accessed data obtained from 87 million Facebook user profiles to develop political advertising that aimed to influence voters. These strategies, of course, were used by the Trump campaign in 2015 to identify possible swing voters and to craft messages that were more likely to resonate and swing the election. This is called micro-targeting, or computational propaganda, and this combines big data with behavioral advertising to influence users at the emotional level. These psychographic methods bypass our cognitive defenses. Cambridge Analytica employee and later whistleblower Christopher Wiley describes this strategy as, quote, psychological warfare mindfuck tool. It was also revealed that this kind of messaging that they were using was deeply steeped in racist and inflammatory themes and messaging. It was widely recognized that Trump's key advisor, Steve Bannon, was involved in Cambridge Analytica, both of which worked on the Brexit and the Trump campaigns. But what has been less recognized is that Cambridge Analytica was a military contractor owned by the SCEL group. So Cambridge Analytica exemplifies what we've learned over these 4 years of research, that these strategies of targeting emotions and identities through digital media for profit, they profit not only political, i.e. election campaign interests, and not only economic interests, advertising, public relations, marketing, but also military investments in these techniques of what some have called exquisite psychological operations, the new evolution of PSYOPs. There are many other examples, of course, of military interest in these techniques. And as one scholar of military propaganda describes, quote, the messages do not have to convince us, i.e. to buy this or to believe that, but in a war or a conflict context, their point may be to induce fear or at least anxiety and thus paralyze resistance, one person at a time. Tailoring messages to each person erodes the solidarity enjoyed by groups who are in fact all facing the same threat. And one of the really interesting things about the Cambridge Analytica micro-targeting techniques is that you and I cannot tell another friend or colleague what ads came to us because there's not an easy way to track those. So this individual messaging is far removed from the good old days when we could all say, hey, did you see that advertising? It's very insidious. So a key aim of this information warfare and this new face of military psych operations involves sowing disinformation to produce confusion and mistrust. And another example of this is that Cambridge Analytica used, you'll see this image in the center of the screen, used this Black Lives Matter type image to suppress Black voters in the 2010 Trinidad election. So we see here how digital media is mobilizing emotion and targeting our affects, ensuring favorable conditions for digital fascism, as we've seen in these instances of military involvement. So these are the explicit ways that platform politics favor alt-right and militant groups. And the ways that right-wing actors have taken up these originally left-wing idioms of identity as political strategies. And these have been remarkably effective at mobilizing white supremacist and misogynist propaganda and organizing. There are countless examples of how the right targets our identities, whether the trolling by the right of so-called social justice warriors, and those are, for those who don't know, social justice warriors are people online who, like perhaps all of us, who advocate for progressive issues online. Or another example from 2016, the Trump campaign targeting African-American voters with dark posts on Facebook, these non-public micro-targeted ads that stated, "Hillary thinks African Americans are super predators," in an explicit effort to depress the voter turnout among African Americans. You'll also likely be aware of the terrible record of Facebook in particular with respect to hate speech moderation. This is an issue for many platforms, as we know, but Facebook and Zuckerberg have been dragged before Congress myriad times in efforts to hold Facebook responsible because its platform architecture and Facebook's policies have failed to moderate hate speech, and in fact have refused to remove political lies in advertising. As you'll remember, algorithms tend to recommend only greater and greater inflammatory far-right content, despite all of the calls to stop those kinds of algorithms. And there's been a great deal of scholarship attending to these issues. We can talk about it in the Q&A. We wanted to mention the work of Ruha Benjamin, Sophia Noble, Sarah Roberts, really good work on this. So finally, it's important to note that these platform politics privilege a very reductive understanding of all manner of issues. Whether in the case of Twitter, of course, we only have 240 characters to describe something, right? And that's got to reduce the issues that we're talking about. But in all of the platforms, what sells, what grabs attention is the emotional rhetoric, not any sort of careful, deliberative dialogue or nuanced arguments. And the research that I've been doing with a collaborative research team of research assistants from OISE, we've been looking at how emotional expression in these social media platforms in relation to narratives around racial belonging, how clear it is that this polarization it benefits from these platform politics and the us-them oppositions that fuel the racist politics of Trumpism in particular, how these profit the platforms. And Silicon Valley, advertising, public relations firms, they know precisely which emotions are profitable, particularly anger, anxiety, enthusiasm, that are used to make things go viral. And these same emotions readily mobilize identity politics. So when identity politics and the politics more broadly of racism and sexism are reduced to these sound bites, we increasingly see how this might generate traction and virality in digital media, but does not advance progressive political causes. So finally, returning to the upside down of identity politics and weaponization of emotion where we began, promoting white supremacy and racism, as we know, are fundamentally emotional, affective enterprises. Prejudice, stereotypes, biases, these beliefs and behaviors rely centrally on emotional judgments. Emotions and affects are not merely individually, privately experienced, but of course are socially constructed and perpetuated through institutions, persistent, mediated repetitions that facilitate the large-scale, collectively shared perceptions and myths like nationalism, patriotism, ideas of us and them, and who is considered the threatening other. These are the patterns of how social media is weaponized to foment political discord and what's known as partisan polarization, how they are used to sow confusion, undermine trust, as we've seen very recently in the electoral process, undermine trust in democracy, in news sources, and to incite violence. So to remind you of the points we really wanted to emphasize, we really want to show how racism and emotionality is being expressed in digital media, not just in the content, of course, but in the infrastructures, and this, the issues of the digital militarism and digital fascism, how they're interconnected, and this upside down of identity politics. So we'll end on one last example that brings us back to this structured confusion and how impossible it is to make sense of Trump's claim that he's the least racist person in the room. This structured confusion, this affective information warfare, takes place through such things that don't look as we expect them to. So this last slide shows that. It shows how white supremacy in digital media today has a whole range of aesthetics that don't necessarily communicate militarism or fascism in the familiar form of swastikas and military fatigues, but might look like, as Elizabeth had mentioned, the Hawaiian shirts of the Boogaloo Boys. The point of that is those Hawaiian shirts precisely are meant as a signal to others within that particular white supremacist culture, right? Or in this case, the aesthetics of the white art, so-called white art collective, whose Twitter feed was jammed full of Pepe the Frog references, which we can clarify in the Q&A, but that's another signal, like the Hawaiian shirts to other white supremacists. So white supremacy often comes in a new form of celebrating so-called white culture, distancing itself from overt racism. And this is a hallmark of the alt-right tactics. In this example, we also see with the Justin for Canon Hinont social movement or platform, how the group is using the murder of this young white boy as the basis for a kind of cultural resurgence of whiteness. So this is all to say the context of info warfare that's wrought by states, politicians, and actors like the Russian Internet Agency, and is often overtly hateful and uses negative emotions, but it often comes in forms that don't look like aggression at all, or that look nothing like traditional warfare aesthetics. So finally, why and how can Trump call himself the least racist person in the room? Because Trump and other actors, Putin or propaganda firms like Cambridge Analytica, have already been able to take advantage of these new forms of communication. In the US and in Canada, we already had an unequal playing field of corporate media. But now it's been turned into a jungle gym of disinformation and conspiracy. No amount of individualized media literacy is going to solve this problem. By now, this is structural. They have definitely gamed the system. Thank you very much. We look forward to hearing your questions and having some conversation now.
And folks can feel free to go ahead and I think you can just turn your camera on and speak if you like, or if you'd like to put a question in the chat window, we're happy to draw from there as well.
You can use the raise your hand option if you wish.
Can I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
Do you remember the name of the Gamergate woman? And I had heard that she had only asked about female characters in video games, and that's how that all started, but I'm trying to look up more details about the actual Gamergate. I remember a moment for me was she was going to talk at a university, I believe in Colorado. She was invited, and at the last minute, that actual talk was canceled because they informed her that in Colorado they have open carry and they could not guarantee her safety. And I was appalled. I thought, this is a big shift in our country. If a person can't go and give a speech or a formal talk at a university because people have pistols in their pocket, then our society is definitely different than the one I grew up in. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Megan. I don't know if you recall that specific name in that case, but I think I could just add to that I wasn't paying attention to Gamergate when it was happening. It's not until years later that I have come to understand what a kind of central function it has had in coordinating the alt-right and the new right-wing movements, as we've been discussing. But in terms of, I think you also asked about the origin moment. The first origin of Gamergate was this, couples fight where this vengeful boyfriend is going on a diatribe. And what was so shocking was really precisely how it then just snowballed and became so many other sites of harassment online, lots of trolling, lots of doxing, like putting people's personal information, like where they live on the internet, women in particular. And this harassment, not only ruining people's ability to, do anything online, but also really bleeding into people's lives in really all-consuming ways. Like people's lives were absolutely destroyed in many ways, targeted in this way.
I have a question, if I may. If no one else wants to go, if there's nothing in the chat.
Go for it.
Right.
Yeah, first off, thank you so much. That was an excellent talk. Sorry, I arrived a little bit late, but I got here as fast as I can. Good. My question actually is, with regards to, we were talking about computational propaganda, which, as you said, bypasses our cognitive defenses through big data and whatnot. Do you think, what is the way in which it bypasses our defenses? And if it does indeed bypass our defenses, is something like, critical media literacy enough of a defense to not be affected by this type of digital propaganda? In other words, is understanding the power of the propaganda or of profitable emotions enough of a defense in order for us not to be affected? Or is there another type of conceptual toolbox that we might need to refer to or to learn or to practice in order to sort of combat, if we want to use the language of defense, these sort of attacks of, as you said, profitable emotionality? I was super fascinated.
Yeah, great question. I noticed that in the chat, Kelly Gingrich asked a similar thing. What is the role of critical digital literacy, and where do we start to counter this? And I have found that this is one of the million-dollar questions right now, right? Because as this all began, say, in the last 5 years or so, in discussions with journalists and policymakers and educators, or with the news, it always comes to this question, like what, in terms of fake news and disinformation, what are we supposed to do about this, right? Is critical literacy enough? So one of the concerns I've had about that is that this downloads the problem to us as individuals. So rather than holding Zuckerberg or the platforms responsible, it somehow downloads it either to educators to figure out the best new, critical literacy approach, or to you and I to figure out how the heck, WTF, we're supposed to make sense of this, right? And then there is also the problem, as you just described, that the way that critical media literacy has been envisioned for these many years has been based on this model of rationality saving the day. So to actually go back to some of what has motivated Elizabeth and I from the beginning is this concern that with this rise of emotionality in this post-truth moment, in fact, even the newspapers capitalized on this. Even the news, like the New York Times, started having a banner saying "Democracy dies in darkness," and and we will give you the facts and only the facts. So one of the things that concerns me about that is, have we had to go right back to where those of us who are do scholarship on emotion have wanted to say for a long time, rationality is not the whole story, right? We need to understand the emotionality, and the fact that critical literacy is envisioned as some sort of rational, we can figure this out, or that news can give us the facts, turns us away from this emotion. So that's a long way around. It doesn't answer what does media literacy that addresses the ways our emotions are exploited and targeted. So it is something that I've worked on with a number of projects, and maybe others want to weigh in on this. I know there's other educators here. Elizabeth, do you want to add to that?
Just a little bit, I think, with respect to the question of media literacy, anecdotally, but I think this is really illustrative. So that last slide that we showed was this hashtag Justice for Canon Hinant White Art Collective. And I don't go looking for these things, honestly. Even though I do this research, I don't go looking for these things online. They actually come to me. The way this came to me, it was a couple of weeks ago, and I noticed, I didn't know, but I noticed that the Canadian government was launching a kind of critical media literacy week. I think that's an annual thing, and it's particularly targeted in high schools and I think elementary schools. So the government is, facilitating resources for educators in those contexts, specifically about critical media literacy, about digital media literacy in particular. And so they had revived this trope of the hippos, right? The hippos in the house hippos. I didn't grow up in Canada, so I didn't recognize it, but apparently there was this kind of public service announcement type trope of hippos, like in the 90s, about how there are little hippos living in your house. And anyway, it's about disinformation, about how people believe everything they see. So they made this commercial, and just out of interest in what the Canadian government is doing with respect to these problems of disinformation, I started clicking around. I looked at this commercial, so I watched it on YouTube, and the very first thing that the YouTube algorithm generated for me to watch, because I clicked on the Canadian government's hippo advertisement about media literacy, the very first thing that was auto-played to me after that was a white supremacist group trafficking under this White Art Collective banner, or it was at least whatever the White Art Collective thing was linked explicitly with the live streaming of this kind of group of parents talking about white culture. So when we talk about, so there's a perfect example, right? The idea that critical media literacy is a set of skills that we can teach to people, when in fact, the YouTube algorithm is already really shoving this kind of extremism down our throats. Like, we have lots of evidence that have shown how the YouTube algorithm is biased toward extremism, and how rampant conspiracy and different disinformation is on the platform. So I just can't echo enough what Megan said about making the problem one of individual literacy. Like, when we are in such a structural context, we have such structural problems that are shaping what our information ecosystems look like at all.
We have quite a number of questions in here. I wonder, I don't know if Sarah Schulman, or if you're still here, Kathleen Gallagher, do you want to articulate your question? They're really important ones.
Yeah, I'm here too. Go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for a wonderful presentation, and you guys have so much information. I don't know where that music's coming from, but it's not me. Oh, okay. So, you know, you're raising this, I mean, you're putting it in a technological frame, but isn't it a larger cultural trope that perpetrators, bullies, police officers, Trump himself are constantly positioning themselves as victims? I mean, that's what you're talking about. And it just seems to be far beyond the digital realm.
Just wondering if that isn't related. Is that related, Kathleen, to what you were asking a bit? Trying to scroll back up there.
Just as you're looking at that, Megan, I mean, I can absolutely, with respect to Sarah's comment, what we've been interested in is looking to the particular ways that digital media and media have changed the context of the public sphere and the possibilities of discourse, the possibilities of like democratic discourse, and the ways that to pay attention to the digital sphere is to not understand the way that digital media works. We can't understand how politics is working today. So I absolutely just underscore and agree with what you said. What we're talking about here far exceeds the digital as some sort of theme. And I personally never would have ever studied digital media were it not for the fact of, in 2016, just kind of being hit in the face with how important it was to have a better understanding of the particular technological context that is kind of greasing the wheels, making the political context possible.
Yeah, I think that's worth emphasizing. I don't think we can distinguish these two. I think that's probably the quick and dirty answer. I'm not sure how we can distinguish a general cultural trope from the digital right now. So it's not simply about cultural ideas being expressed in the context of digital media, but how those platforms themselves shape what we can express and how we can express it. And yeah.
I can chime in.
Yeah.
Yeah, Megan, you've just said what I was thinking, but better than I was thinking it. I think my question really was about certain economic imperatives and systems being propped up in this time in particular, because there is a kind of craving for goodness, for visual representations of goodness, because we face such ugliness over and over. And so it becomes a kind of rationale for certain expedient economic systems. And I think Trump saying, I'm the least racist person in the world, it was a very old notion of power and charity and haves and have-nots, that we're so far beyond now. We're so outside that paradigm, even though there is grotesque inequality all over the globe. But I think affect, even of those, let's say, in more progressive circles, may inadvertently be desiring of a certain kind of familiarity around goodness and giving that bolsters the very kinds of manipulative statements that get made by especially those in power who bring no sense of analysis to that power.
Yes. Yeah, it brings to mind yesterday in my research team, Ali was talking about one of the most popular threads on Facebook that he was looking at was Trump supporters sharing memes or GIFs that provided so-called evidence of Trump doing all of these charitable acts. And part of what we're looking at is yeah, sort of the binaries of how this goodness gets framed again and again, how badness gets framed as goodness and vice versa, so that we don't know whether it's up or down. And one of the things that struck me in that context that Ali was talking about was, because of the kinds of media that we're talking about, a lot of these are quote unquote, you know, fakes. I don't know if they're deep fakes, but they're, in fact, he didn't do that charitable act, but our digital media can present it as if he did. And then the conversation becomes whether this was true or not, and who mistrusts who in this equation, creating this upside down, which is part of where we began. Elizabeth, do you have any, I think there's other questions here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of questions in the chat, but we'd love if people would just come and say them to us, because it's kind of hard to listen and read them and
really
gather
is.
them all at the same time. I guess the only thing that I would add to that last issue about the kind of, and what you were referencing was beyond just virtue signaling, but actually like this complicated way that people do like a lot of soul searching, I think, in like the digital sphere, because it is a way that we're, you know, connected to life quite obviously today. So there's the issue of the obfuscation, which is one of the key things to be paying attention to, the way that right-wing movements are intentionally obfuscating things and using terms that don't mean what they mean. Like we saw after the election of Donald Trump, the sales of 1984 by George Orwell just shot through the roof, right? Because people recognized the kind of newspeak that was becoming part of our lives. So it's important to look at that obfuscation. It's important to, I think, to look at it seriously, because we keep seeing people like Steve Bannon say that they're talking about populism, and we know they're not talking about populism. They're using populism, for example, and this is just one example of one key figure. And I talked about others in the presentation about how the alt-right obfuscates its meaning and its relation to white supremacy. But Bannon uses populism as a banner to traffic in this kind of white supremacist and ultranationalist and fascist organizing. So there's the issue of obfuscation in terms of what people are signaling and how people are trying to like rope people into their side and how digital technologies, other media are constantly used to do that. And there's the reduction, the soundbite economy of politics that Megan talked about, and how platforms really focus that. But I guess your question and Megan's response also just made me think of the kind of like of the Carl Schmitt's understanding of fascism, or understanding of politics, which is a fascist understanding of politics, about politics being about fundamentally this distinction between your friend and your enemy. And the way that I think I mean, it's off the top of my head, but it seems like a lot more in digital media, people are looking really quickly to understand who's your friend and who's your enemy. And as Megan ended with, this obviously doesn't help us talk about complex issues at all, and we're facing a lot of really complex political issues right now.
I'm wondering if I could just ask for you to comment on like your research. This is so interesting, especially in light of where we are right now with COVID, especially. And the election was definitely a very interesting roller coaster of disinformation and, like, you know, don't believe your eyes, believe what I tell you. But I'm also wondering about people's desire to feel like victims in a COVID environment right now, and what you've been, just like, what have you been finding is really interesting or surprising to you during COVID and all the conspiracy theories that have been flying around, or what was completely predictable and you could have told me exactly how this was going to play out if we said there was a pandemic coming a couple years ago?
What a interesting question. And one of the things that strikes me is it is indeed so hard to extract what's happening in a global pandemic from the other phenomenon that we are seeing. So I don't even know that I can, how to address that. But one thing that does strike me is, and I see it in a number of the questions, is this desire to be, to posture as the victim, or to claim that identity of victimhood. And in the research that we're doing with my team, we keep finding, and that Elizabeth and I are talking about this, the fact that the left and that the right has appropriated identity politics, or what has traditionally been left-wing discourse. And that can seem, and in the research that we're doing of digital media, it can appear that in fact, the same discourse could come out of the side of the right or the left. You could actually interchange it. However, we know that it is not precisely equivalent, right? But I find these examples of people wanting to present as the victims so fascinating. So for example, in the recent March for Trump, there were supposedly some events in which the white folks who were marching for Trump were attacked. And that immediately within social media, I'm not even talking about necessarily Fox News framing that, but within social media, people wanted to claim that this was precisely what had happened, that they were experiencing what Black Lives Matter had claimed was happening, right? Both in original murders, or not that murder had occurred, or within what the police were doing. They also wanted to claim that the police were not protecting them. These are the Trump marchers, and that the media was not representing their plight. So one of the things that I'm finding so fascinating is how in this moment of feeling like, also feeling like the losers in the election, right? That I think we're going to see that narrative of victimization be even more acutely expressed. So that's one of the things that I'm seeing. I don't think it connects necessarily to the COVID, though of course the whole issue of masks and not masks does, you know, those who are advocating freedom from wearing masks is a discourse, I think, that fits in with this very much.
I have a couple of questions that were actually emailed. First question to either Megan or Elizabeth is, what is the role of critical media literacy in challenging the ultra-right, and how do we re-engage with critical media literacy? And the second question that kind of, I think, Megan, you've just touched on it, is Black Lives Matter and the right, and how you can switch the discourses and they would almost be identical. Question number two is around how did this white art collective, what did they utilize to make their messages reach a wider audience and make it more easily conceptual that Black Lives Matter was not able to, or successful in infiltrating?
So maybe I'll just respond to that last question, because this white art collective, it was an example that it's not like a huge or particularly popular example of where people are, like, it's not lots of followers on this account or anything. So it was more of an example of the kinds of everyday digital fascism and white supremacy that is coming into lots of different digital spaces in ways, as Megan was saying at the end of our presentation, in ways that don't look like the traditional aesthetics of fascism, right? And I was also like, what is a more left-wing thing than like starting an art collective for your political cause? So I just thought it was a pretty like poignant example. And there wasn't anything that I wanted to suggest there about that being a larger narrative than BLM. What I was saying about how the YouTube algorithm in particular works has to do with, so all of the algorithms of different social media companies are black boxed, they're proprietary. And it's because that's how they like make money. It's their special sauce for these different platforms. So we don't know how they work exactly. And some people really want to understand how they work. And in some ways, I personally don't need to know that much more about how they work, because we already have so much information about how the folks who, so sorry, let me back up a little bit. We can look to the scholars who have already shown how biases are built into algorithms and machine intelligence and so forth. So like Ruha Benjamin's doing a lot of important work on this. Sophia Noble is doing a lot of important work on this. And then like the specific questions of how people tag their videos when you upload them, that's really crucial to how people are going to be fed like a white supremacist content. So, and I don't know, only the person kind of plugging in their YouTube videos will know that, but it's not difficult to figure out. And sorry, where was I? Yeah, so I didn't want to say that that was like a message that was in particular louder than BLM, just to clarify that aspect.
Maybe that's how they, yeah, that's maybe how it was understood, but it's clear. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a comment. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
So when that art collective, a friend of mine posted that, an old teacher friend posted justice for that child. And just my comment is that that came at the very height of justice for Brianna. And when nothing, very little was being done for her. And the child that was killed, the person was arrested on the spot. So it's exactly what you're saying, this imitation of a real movement, and there was no movement. This child had been killed. The person was a neighbor that was arrested instantly. And yet they were creating this movement that this child needed justice and taking energy from a very real issue with Breonna Taylor.
Yeah, absolutely. And just maybe more, I can explain a little bit more for folks who hadn't heard of this. I hadn't heard of it until I, looked it up based on this hashtag. I was curious. So Cannon Hinant was a little boy, a white boy who was shot in his yard, and the person who was arrested for it was a black man who was their neighbor, and they're kind of friends with their neighbor, and there's really no known motive. And the parents they said, like the parents and the grandparents were all like, we don't believe anything is racially motivated here. So it's a horrible thing that happened where the people involved really were not talking about any racial motivation. And it was seized upon by right-wing news outlets and these right-wing actors who very, very obviously were trying to orchestrate a propaganda campaign around this. They're taking advantage of this by saying, look, when a white boy is killed, nobody cares. The media will only cover this issue of violence when Black people are killed. So it's very, very obvious if you just look at what the story is, that this is an intentional orchestration of propaganda. And that kind of thing is becoming more and more successful. Like Megan, you had that really great example. What was it? Like we keep seeing lots of really good examples of the right wing just launching onto something and being so effective at changing public consciousness. Megan, we were talking about the election and how so many people like liberals and centrists were saying things like,
Right.
I really think the Democrats failed by hitching their wagon to Black Lives Matter and defund the police. And that's why we Democrats didn't win in a landslide. And in fact, these mainstream Democrats did not hitch their wagon to BLM. They absolutely did not say defund the police. Kamala Harris continually advertised herself as a top cop, right? So this has been a right-wing propaganda piece that has been very successfully mobilized, and I hear it all around. I've heard it all around among like centrists and liberals who bought it, so it seems.
So how ironic that the camp themselves, the partisan camp of leftists and center Democrats, suddenly come to think that their own party took up that platform, when in fact it was Trump and the right that very carefully figured out how to rewire that and make it seem that the Democrats had hitched their wagon to defund the police. And I was actually wanted to emphasize, if people want to look at the book Network Propaganda, I think it's so important to take stock of the ways in which since 2005, since the advent of digital media, that the right has figured out how to monopolize and absolutely connect all the dots of digital media for the sake of network propaganda. And many of us will have heard in the aftermath of the election these frustrations on the part of grassroots groups that the Democrats are still using old traditional media. And I think someone in here had this comment that Democrats are using old media, spending billions of dollars on television ads, when in fact, those are not reaching audiences, and they are not they're not up to speed on the use of digital and social media for this kind of for the kind of advertising that is needed. And in fact, it was grassroots organizing, such as with Stacey Abrams in Georgia, that really got out the vote. So I think that's just so utterly key. And yet, to bring back to the upside down of all this, there are other very confusing moments in this historical period, such as the exit polls of the election, and the fact that while identity politics and certainly white supremacy explains a great deal, how do we understand the exit polls and the numbers of Latino communities, for example, Latinx communities that voted apparently in Marxist lingo against their best interests, right? And these are very complicated questions. And one of the things I would suggest about that is that I'm trying to understand in my study of social media whether or not it's the case that identity politics, as a very reductive version of how to understand the world, arguably, how does it perhaps lend itself towards the reductive digital infrastructures that we've talked about? That's one of the tacks that I'm interested in, but I'm sure others have thoughts. Where are we at, Ahmed?
We have about half an hour left. Any more questions?
I do have another question, unless someone else wants to go who hasn't spoken yet.
So we'll maybe take a couple more questions, so go ahead.
Sure. This is just going back to a couple of points ago that you had made regarding, Elizabeth, you had mentioned understanding algorithms, and I don't whether or not one needs to understand anything more about algorithms. The question is, does understanding how an algorithm works actually do anything at all towards, again, this question of bypassing our cognitive defenses that Megan was mentioning, halfway through the presentation. Sort of, I'm on the cusp of the generation that has learned. Well, this is sort of taken from a media theorist, Franco Berardi, has learned more information about the world than from their own mothers or from human beings. And so for the younger generations now who are, so immersed in digital platforms, in an all-encompassing way, has the ability to have cognitive defenses been eroded by submersion into the virtual?
I think maybe I should I'll respond to the first part of something that you raised, although I don't know if I have an answer for the second part. But with respect to algorithms, so studying algorithms, I'll redact what I said about like we don't need to understand algorithms. What I mean to say is that there are some angles of research that really emphasize that we need transparency with social media companies and digital media companies in order to understand how their algorithms work so that we can understand what's going on. And my point there is not that we don't need to understand algorithms, but that we already do have, in many ways, a lot of understanding of the harmful effects of many of these algorithms. And the idea that if we just if they just crack open the black box, that we're going to understand fascism better and like the actual effects of the promotion of extremism. I'm just resisting that idea. And certainly there are people who are doing fabulous work in digital media studies who would really disagree with me and think it's much more important that we crack open those black boxes. So that's what I meant to say earlier about algorithms in particular.
Thank you.
One place where, as a scholar, I know, perhaps as well speaking for my team and many digital media scholars, where we are frustrated with that black box is that Facebook in particular has provided no transparency of how, of their algorithms, of how they are figuring out the micro-targeting that we spoke of before, for example. Just absolutely none. And it's really quite outrageous because there are severe limits to how, as scholars, we can, one of my motivations for part of the work I do is for the scholarly sector and the public sector to be able to catch up to the private sector in terms of their understanding of how big data can be brought together with behavioral psychology to do this work. And so in the scholarly world, we've had this huge upsurge of interest in emotion and affect over the past decade or 15 years. And we have more nuanced understandings of emotion and affect that I think can help social scientists. I think that speaks as well for the value of interdisciplinary work. But we're quite limited by the lack of money, in part, at ever catching up to advertisers, to Silicon Valley, in terms of how they are targeting emotion. So that also limits how we can even begin to answer the question around what does media literacy look like at this moment, right? So I think there's a real question about the way in which Facebook has become the arbiter of truth, arbiter of ethics, arbiter of what we can and can't see. So that really concerns me. And just your comment about have our cognitive defenses been eroded by our immersion in digital media? I think that's part of what you were saying.
Yeah.
It's such a, I mean, I think something we've said a few times here is not only the speed, we didn't emphasize, the concept of the attention economy. I mean, we kind of alluded to it, but obviously this economy is wanting to move us very quickly from, because clickbait journalism is not measured on how long we necessarily stay on the page, right? That's another thing that's very difficult for scholars to measure. You can say, oh, this many people looked at that article. You don't necessarily know how much time they spent reading that, or if they even read it, right? But the profit measurements simply look at how many people appeared to read that article or that headline. So the point being, in this attention economy, speed is of utmost import, and that a very reductive sense of what counts as understanding. And last thing I'd want to say about that, I never thought that I would, sound as much like an old fogey about the fact that we don't have a common sense of the world anymore. We don't have We don't have a shared news source in common. And there's no way we're going to ever be able to go back to that. I mean, that's just gone. I can't see how we're, you know, and I'm not saying that that solved everything and created a fantastic, beautiful public sphere, but it certainly slowed us down and ensured that we had some version of the same reality.
Thank you. That was great from both of you.
And also the specific role of digital media within challenging corporate media that Megan has also written so much about, I just think is, in terms of what you're discussing about the shared common reality and how that has historically been presented in limited corporate media forms. One of the things Megan and I have been really interested in is watching how, like in the origin of Web 2.0 and participatory media, a lot of the discourse around not believing mainstream media was coming from the left wing. And there was good reason, if you remember, to not believe what was happening in mainstream media in the United States following September 11th with regard to the war mobilization for Iraq and Afghanistan. So digital media activism at that time was really left wing, also libertarian, but it was really centered in the left wing. And today we see a lot of distrust of media, distrust of dominant narratives, obviously on the right wing, as we've been discussing. And that has been a really interesting shift that we can see, I think, more clearly now in terms of what's happened over the last 20 years in terms of trust in media and institutions. So just wanted to add that in there. That it also corresponds with the rise of Fox News, another crucial point, not just digital media. There are always other factors as well.
Yeah, and that a really quick point, that one of my concerns about whatever form media literacy takes now, that when it gets reduced to fact checking, it seems to me it's a very crude notion that has moved us so far away from the question of how we analyze the perspective and bias and spin within the whatever, you know, so-called facts we're reading, right? So everyone's just like, oh my God. So for example, do you not tend in this day and age to say, oh, well, it's the Washington Post or it's the New York Times, therefore I feel confident sharing it with my colleague or my friend, saying, okay, I feel a little bit. But what happened to those days when before I shared that, as Elizabeth was saying, in the early days of the internet, it was sort of a leftist field heyday, you know. It was a party for left-wing critique of corporate-owned media like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and being able to say, look at this spin, as in with the Iraq War, right? So yeah, those days are gone. Now it's just like, oh, well, thank God it's from a known source, as if that's sufficient. So I know one of the things that I really advise is that we look at international sources and do quite a bit of comparison so that we don't fall into that, like that it's enough that it's a recognized source from the center.
I think one thing I might add to the question of media literacy and fact checking and the kind of disintegration of truth, just to add another piece, as if we haven't already put a lot on the table. But when it comes to the way that truth and facts and fact checking are being framed vis-a-vis science, I think is really interesting, and the kind of return to reason rhetoric that Megan talked about, because I just think it's something for us to watch going forward, because we all know that this rhetoric about science is really important for climate change debates, right? And how, like, Joe Biden certainly didn't hitch his wagon to BLM, but he did hitch his wagon to science, saying, I believe in science. Of course, the disinformation about COVID is often framed as in, we need to believe in science. So there's a lot of this rhetoric about we need to believe in science, which is centrist and left-wing because of the way that it supports causes that are important, progressive causes that are important, or just the project of keeping one another safe from this horrible pandemic. But there are also ways that that rhetoric of a return to reason, to science, to truth and established authority is just not going to cut it. And Megan was talking about how that kind of rhetoric is so pervasive within the study of political science and the way that emotion has been treated in political science, and really the way that the question of who gets to call themselves the reasonable actor has always been circumscribed by whiteness and masculinity in the first place, right? So there are ways that this question of belief in science, I think, is often trotted out as, yes, we on the left must believe, or liberals must believe in science, and use this as like yet another soundbite or rhetorical point. And I think this is something for us to watch, because that reductive approach to science is, I don't think it's going to help us.
Doris, I don't know if you're still there. You just raised a really important question, and then maybe we want to begin to wrap things up.
Hi, Megan, and
Hi.
hi, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for your talk. And I'm, you know, the question comes from a place where I was trying to think about ways, as someone who identifies as radical or left, how I might be affected by digital media. And, you know, so my question, you know, so I was really trying to think about what might sort of mobilize me effectively. And one of the ways that I definitely have that experience is when I see videos of police aggression, abuse, you know, killing, murder towards you know, Black folks, or even just everyday, this sort of everyday aggression that someone who is Black or Indigenous or identifies as a person of color might record and then post. And I was just thinking, I wanted to get more to thinking about that role of affect, and what does it do when it comes in this digital form to our democracy. So I think that, and I think there are different impacts of that video for different people, but I'm imagining that you talked about some of this, and I'm curious just what came up in your research.
Elizabeth?
That's such a good question, but I kind of don't know where to begin. But I was wondering, Megan, if you wanted to talk about affective feedback loops, or I think I'm still gathering my thoughts.
So Doris, you're wanting to know specifically about affect in relation to perceptions of your political positioning, or can you say a little more about that?
No, well, there were two things. The one is I was trying to think, how might I be impacted affectively, you know, online, and I thought about these murders of Black men and women specifically as things that give me that charge. But then I was thinking more broadly of what is the impact on democracy or civic life more broadly, you know, when just using maybe this kind of video as an example that has, I think, probably is interpreted and experienced very differently depending on the subject position you occupy.
Yes, yes, what a great. Well, one of the ways I think about this is one has to do with the contradictions of the role that digital media technologies and that witnessing play at this particular moment. So we think back to the video recording that was made of Rodney King, and how that absolutely influenced how we thought and were able to think about that. And then the way that these in the moment recordings of the murder of Black folk that I think you're referring to, some of the ways that those get documented and then are circulated, and the work that they're doing. And I think it's so important to ask the question of how those are taken up and have different impacts depending on who we are. I really appreciate this essay by Elizabeth Alexander, Can I Be Black and Look at This?, that talks about the history of this kind of violence and the embodied history of that. And so what it means then to see that. And yet for some of us, that witnessing was so crucial. And when you think about George Floyd, I mean, this would not have reemerged in the way that it did without that capture, right? There's a scholar, I can send you the name of this book, I may not think of it right now, who's writing about this and writing specifically about how digital media has been used for witnessing within Black communities. So of course the double-edged sword of that is that those same technologies that were used to capture this and to help re-spark this really important Black Lives Matter movement, and to get white people on board with that, because you could not avert your eyes, or maybe you could, but there was no denying it. Here it is, right? Something that white folks may not have experienced in our flesh and blood. And yet the capture of that also signals the way that surveillance is happening on the part of the police, right? So it's this double-edged sword. And I don't think there's an easy way to make sense of the double-edged nature of this digital media. So those are the thoughts, some of the thoughts that come to mind with what you're talking about. I mean, the more specific questions of what emotions are aroused, like, in what ways is that exploitative? In what ways is that image exploitative, and for whom? And who profits? It's such a complicated question. Elizabeth, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, I think I have so many thoughts about this, and I guess I'll just maybe respond in terms of the question of the impact on democracy. And like a good academic, I'll just respond with questions rather than answers. Because one of the things that I think has become really apparent in this context of, we've talked about affective information warfare. One thing we didn't talk about today, but which Megan and I talk about a lot, is polarization and the discourse on polarization and kind of where it's at in different fields, and really in public discourse, because we definitely see a lot of affective polarization in, like, I'm thinking just contemporary North American politics. And by that, I don't mean partisan polarization, like voting for this or that party, although that's certainly related, or affective polarization in terms of who, I don't know, there are different ways that different disciplines, I think, are taking this up. I guess what I'm interested in is the way that politics feels to be so much about how other people have the wrong feelings about things.
Yeah.
And I find this to be really interesting because I feel that all the time. And there's a certain way that as a scholar of emotion and affect, I'm fascinated not just by the idea that emotions cause particular political outcomes, but the way that we can look at how sentiments actually structure our political relations, like nationalism, for example. That's like, a lot of affect theory, like Lauren Berlant's work and so forth. But I guess I'm just sitting with this question of what it means that politics today really is being experienced as a phenomenon of how other people have the wrong feelings about things. And I think this is expressed in my own research. I'm thinking about this in terms of like woke cultural politics and the woke culture industry, and how the idea of being woke, which is some idea of critical consciousness, which comes out of Black Lives Matter activism. I mean, it's been subject to so much controversy, but it also itself is about, or seems to be about, referencing some sort of subjective interior quality of one's political orientation. So there is this like intense subjective element of politics that really feels like it's at the surface today, and absolutely, as we've described, is manifested in digital media. But I guess I just wanted to highlight that and pose that as a question, not a, I don't have any simple thoughts on like, where do we go from here, I guess.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
Final comment, please.
In late October, a Black man was killed in Philadelphia after wielding a knife. And there was a huge protest. His name was Walter Wallace. And maybe some of you know that young mom, African-American or Black mom, was driving to pick up her nephew with her baby in the car. And her minivan was surrounded when she accidentally drove down the street with a police barricade. And they took her child and photographed themselves and said this child was found wandering around a protest barefoot, and it was put on Facebook. It was later taken down. She was taken to the police, not charged because she hadn't done anything but try to get home after picking up her teen nephew. But I keep looking on outlets and I can't. This video was filmed by someone on their roof of this van being swarmed. Her purse was taken, her phone was taken, and she didn't even get her minivan back that I know of. I can't find any information. And so I guess I feel like there's a certain ownership in the media and which videos are let in and which aren't. We haven't been able to even really talk about why certain videos get so much old school press. And to me, this video is very important because it was an innocent mom, and I think so. Anyway, I think this video should have gotten a lot more. And there's so much going on again with the confusion you guys have talked about, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you so much for that. And Ahmed, I know you. Time to close.
Well, if you want to respond, go ahead.
Great,
And then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, great last comment there. How do we make the bridge? How can these observations be shared not only with scholars, but with publics, and how important that is indeed, given everything we've been talking about. And I know, I think it's so important to figure out how to articulate this in opinion editorials, in letters to the editor, in public comment pieces in the news. And I was just talking with colleagues about how, in fact, it can be very challenging to get both to write something that has a bit of complexity and isn't just a quick soundbite. How to get that into these news outlets, and that I think there's a lot of policing. As Kathy was just mentioning, a policing on the part of news outlets, of course, as to what they care to publish and which views. So I find it's, particularly if you are talking critically about journalism, they do not want to publish that. And Elizabeth and I have had that experience trying to get something published about Steve Bannon and the ways that news takes that up. So this is a very important question and very challenging, but really important to get it out there.
On that note, thank you, Catherine, for your last comment. Thank you, Megan and Elizabeth, for a fantastic talk, walking us through digital media within the moment, soundbite politics in the age of Trump, identity politics and memes being turned on their head. Thank you so much. The title of the text, the edited collection, is Affect Politics of Digital Media, Propaganda by Other Means. Please do go out and get it when it comes out, 2020. Rutger. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us on a SJA talk. Have a wonderful break. Stay safe and be well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Ahmed and Kali, and thank you so much to everyone who tuned in with us and for your questions and showing your faces. And thanks so much. It was a pleasure to be able to talk about our work in progress and some of our work that we've been doing. So stay safe. Take care.
Fantastic. And thank you, Kali. Be well, everyone. Take care.
Kali.